On January 23, 1855, a bridge opened over the Mississippi River in a place we call Minneapolis. That year, a public school called the Iowa Institute for the Deaf and Dumb opened its doors. Charlotte Bronte, the author of the first major feminist novel, passed away. Frederick Douglass published his seminal book, My Bondage and My Freedom. In the same year, John Flournoy proposed that the United States create a colony or state exclusively for deaf people, what the deaf advocate himself called, quote, a small republic of our own, under our sovereignty and independent of all hearing interference. Also, in 1855, two towns called Faribault and Northfield in the young Minnesota Territory were platted out. This is the 1855 History Podcast about Minnesota, the 19th century, and doing history. I'm one of your hosts, Sam Temple. With Logan Ledman, I produce documentaries about local history. Several years ago, we created a short documentary on the history of the Faribault Woolen Mill. For that documentary, we had the pleasure of interviewing Lisa M. Bolt-Simons, who is an author who has written a book on the history of the mill. Today, we are sharing snippets from our interview with Lisa in January of 2017. Logan and I began by discussing the origins of Karl Klemmer, the man who led the woolen mill in its early years.
Karl Klemmer came from Germany, and he moved around a lot and finally ended up in Faribault. And back then, of course, we didn't have Macy's and we didn't have Targets. And because of that, they had their farm animals and they provided the food, they provided their clothing. And that's when someone suggested that he start this carting factory. And that's why he started, was back in 1865. And actually, I drive by it. It's now the parking lot right behind the sheriff and deputy in Rice County. So now it's a parking lot, but there was this wooden building and probably smaller than this room, and that's where he started his carting business.
How did the mill grow in its early years under Karl Klemmer's leadership?
I think it was need, and I think it was persistence, and it was just a belief in he was doing what people needed. And that's really the bottom line. And I think as back then, when you start hearing about whether it was the competition in Minneapolis with their mills, you have to remember that mills back then that was a big deal. That's what they did. They made the fabric, and then the fabric went home to the women to make the clothes. That was a need back then. He was a good enough businessman that he realized what he had to do in order to appease his customers, and probably customers back then. Clients probably wasn't the word back then, but that's what he did. He did what his customers needed him to do in order to survive, quite honestly, because if they're not going to have clothes or they don't have warm enough clothes in this wonderful Minnesota weather.
So the mill continues for decades, and eventually both world wars affect Minnesota. How does the woolen mill contribute to the war effort?
Blankets. Yeah, blankets. They made these blankets. They're called OD. I went to Minnesota State University in Mankato, and they have archives there. Richard Klemmer had taken a whole bunch of items, check registers, books, photos, all these things over there for the safekeeping. And I came across this OD, and I had no idea what's OD. Turns out it's olive drab. And so you think about the army green blankets, and wool back then, of course, was flame resistant. And that's exactly what the soldiers needed in order to stay warm and hopefully be more safe. And so not only did they make the blankets, but of course they needed to build on the community in order to have the employees to make all those blankets. In fact, in my book, I have a picture of the record of goods. And this was back in 1945. And they made the equivalent of almost 250,000 blankets based on what the blankets were and also some of the cloth. And record of goods is in that in Mankato at the library. And so that was really interesting to find.
What kind of products did the woolen mill create during its peak?
Airplane blankets. Yeah. And I am old enough to remember getting blankets and pillows, which they don't do anymore. You barely even get a TV tray or a little tray anymore, but I digress. But pillows and blankets, that was really the biggest contracts was with those airliners. And that was back in the 1980s. And that really took off. And quite literally, their product soared from place to place. And so if you are getting customers, airline customers, flying across the United States and they're like, wait, hey, this blanket's keeping me warm, that really probably triggered a lot more of the interest in the blankets as well. So yeah, that was pretty much their heyday, I think, at the time. So
When did things start going wrong for the mill?
1990s. 1990s. And then by 1997, the two brothers, Tom and Dave Clemmer, and collectively, there was an executive management staff, but with Dave and Tom being the last two of the Clemmer family, they really felt like in order to save the mill, they had to bring in some outside investors. The problem with outside investors is that they are outside. And I think that's what ultimately ended up helping with the demise of its heyday. Because the outside investors, I believe, based on talking to people, that they didn't care about Faribault as a community. And that was really where it started turning the wrong way, bringing in outside investors. But Tom actually has some really nice quotes in my book. Nice in that they're perfect, but sad. He was very heartbroken that they had to make that decision. You either sell to these outside investors and get help, or your family's company closes. And so he had to make a very difficult decision. Unfortunately, they did have to shut their doors in 2009. 2010, there was a horrible flood. When we were downstairs in the basement taking a tour, the flood line was higher than our heads. So when Paul Moody was approached and this guy was emailing him and saying, hey, do you want to go in? You want to go see this mill? And Paul's like, no. Really don't want to, but this guy kept sending him emails. And finally, he's like, fine, I'll go see the mill. And there's a quote in here where he says, now, if I would have shown up, someone would have handed me the keys and said, go look around. He never, ever would have said, this is what we need to do. Instead, he had a longtime employee there, Dennis Melkert. He took them on a tour and he gave them stories. So there'd be a story here. So even if they're in the deep, dark basement, there is this wonderful, beautiful story about the success of the mill. And that's what convinced Paul and his cousin Chuck to give it a second chance. And that's what they did.
What effect has the mill had on the local community?
You have some long-time employees there, long time, including Mary Boudreau, who is 81 maybe now, has worked at the mill for about 60 years. And that is like her second home. And I really think that the long-term employees, especially before it closed, before things started going downhill in the 1990s, they really had a family kind of relationship. So it just wasn't the Clemmer family, but it was the employees altogether. There was a loyalty. There was a commitment to that mill. And I really think that once that started to unravel in the 1990s, and then by the time it shut down, that was lost. And I know that there are still some employees today who are working there who have been there for quite a while, but I also know that they've been hiring some new people. And there's quite a mix of the old and new. But back in its heyday, the mill was a part of the community. It was one of the hearts of the community, I honestly believe.
Why is this story important to tell?
I think sometimes we take it for granted that there are some quality products made by people who believe in what they do. They believe in their job and they're good at it. For example, Mary Boudreau. She knows that equipment, she knows what she's doing, and there's just a commitment and a loyalty that I think some companies don't necessarily see anymore. And going to a global company. So if your company headquarters is in, say, Minneapolis, but you've got satellite companies around the world, whether it's in Japan or whether it's in Spain or whether it's in Dominican Republic, I think it loses that sense of family because it's too big. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Faribault Woolen Mill is important, because it didn't move from Faribault. It stayed here. since 1865. And instead of going somewhere and saying, you know what? Yeah, you know what? We can make way more money if we go to Minneapolis, St. Paul. We can make way more money if we go out to New York City. But they didn't want to do that. And I think that's an important part of Faribault, Minnesota, is this story, this family story and this employee story, because a lot of employees have invested their time and energy and love into this place.
Thank you again to Lisa for that wonderful interview. It was a pleasure to talk to you in 2017, and it was a pleasure to revisit today. Thank you for listening to the 1855 History Podcast. We hope everyone has a good holiday weekend. If you'd like to support the 1855 History Team, you can find us on Facebook and YouTube. You can support us on Patreon, where we release exclusive content, including a bonus podcast, monthly live streams, and more. I say more with a question mark because I don't remember all of the Patreon perks right now. Thank you for listening to the 1855 History Podcast. Stay warm, everyone.